True Crime Conversations acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast was recorded on. On a bright, hot, sunny day in Adelaide in 1966, the three children of Jim and Nancy Beaumont went to the beach. It was January 26th, a public holiday in South Australia then, although it would be another nearly 30 years before it would become a nationally recognised one. The mercury was rising into the 40s that day, and while Jim was away for work, Nancy had to occupy those three kids, all under the age of 10, for the entire day by herself. Three kids who knew that their summer school holidays were fast running out. So when Jane, the eldest at 9 years old, suggested she take her 7-year-old sister Arnna and little brother Grant, who was just 4, to the nearby Glenelg Beach for the morning, Nancy was all too happy to send them off on another easy adventure. It wasn't far to go. They'd been there before, and the spot on Adelaide's western suburban shore would be packed with other people on a public holiday Wednesday. So off they went, the three little Beaumont children, with their bathers on, their towels around their necks, and a purse full of change, handed over by Mum for lunch and a bus fare. Now, in a crowd of hundreds, three little kids might be noticed by many of them, or none at all, as they raced to the sandy shore and cool relief of the ocean. But researchers who've been chasing the whereabouts of these three for decades believe they were noticed by at least one man, the worst possible man. And as the years pass and more people come forward with stories relating to this man, could they have finally solved the mystery about what happened to Jane, Arnna and Grant Beaumont? I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In 2026, the Beaumont children will have been missing for 60 years. But despite that passage of time, their case continues to haunt those who investigate it. How could three children be taken in broad daylight in front of hundreds? How could no one have seen where they went? And how did one of those children end up in a bakery with more money than she ever left her house with that day? Author Stuart Mullins, who grew up in the same neighbourhood as the Beaumonts, and former detective turned private investigator Bill Hayes, have slowly been unravelling the stories around a man who not only had the opportunity to snatch Jane, Arnna and Grant, but who also led a life that suggested that their disappearance was not a crime of opportunity, but rather a carefully planned luring in of three innocent lives to satisfy a depraved section of society. Who is the Satin Man? And why haven't police ever really looked into his movements on the day the Beaumont children disappeared, seeing as his house was literally in sight of the last places they were seen alive? Stuart and Bill join us now. Stuart, I'd like to kick off our conversation with you today. You have spent so many years researching the disappearance of the Beaumont children, and you, like me, grew up closer to where this all unfolded in Adelaide. Why do you think this case has had such a lasting personal impact on you?
There is an emotional an attachment too, and a few people have said, and even Bill said, you can see that in the, when I write the first chapter of the Beaumont generation. That was me. That was the Mullins family. It was the Beaumont family, may have been your family growing up around the streets of Glenelg. We did exactly what Jane, Arnna and Grant did. That was my life. So it was I could easily write, and I could feel, when three children go down to Collie Reserve, as I did, as I would say you did, then you went with the belief that you were free, you were having a good time, and there was no way you could have got attacked or abducted. And it was those three that really brought it home. It brought it home to my parents. I remember my mother started to look out for where we were going, wanted to know where we were. So it was the day that Australia lost its innocence, because three children being abducted and disappeared from Collie Reserve has not happened before, and it hasn't happened since, not just in Australia but worldwide. It's a one-off and so unusual, which goes down to the thing how brazen and confident that individual was. And it's that connection. As you were born in South Australia with Collie Reserve, I frequented Collie Reserve. I knew exactly their lifestyle. The Paringa Park Primary School that Jane and Arnna attended was only just down the road from my primary school, Darlington Primary School. And it was about 4Ks in difference, and I used to play footy on their oval. I knew where they lived. My grandmother lived about 400 metres from where Nancy and Jim Beaumont lived, so I knew the Somerton Park. So there's a very in-depth emotional connection.
We did actually speak to you about this case on this podcast back in 2019, a conversation that you had with Jessie Stevens, who was hosting at the time. What has changed since then? Because Nancy had died the year before you spoke to Jessie, but Jim was still alive back then. So in that 6 years, what's changed about this case?
Well, since the book came out, firstly, the Satin Man came out, and then, Bill was heavily involved, which gave a lot of credibility. You may look at me and say, well, he's after notoriety and he's an upstart. But when you get Bill Hayes involved, who's a former detective and a federal investigator and a private investigator now, it adds that credibility. So ears started to prick up. And adding him to the team, I say a small team, it started to get even the media interested. And what happens when you put out a true crime book, and we've seen this over and over again, people start to come forward that have kept silent. Now, why have they kept silent? Is because the fear of not being believed. And we've seen that time and time again. We saw it with Rolf Harris. He was plying his trade. People did come forward and they were discarded, not Rolf Harris. It would have been the same with Fipps. So when people come forward and speak out and there's a similarity between what they're saying and they're not connected. So you're starting to build a picture. And since the last podcast, the picture has been building. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever in my mind, and I would say Bill's, that Harry Fipps is the instigator. But what we've found out, it's much more in-depth than I think even we anticipated. So it's people coming forward one after another, feeling emboldened that they can now speak out and be believed.
Well, we'll get into a little bit more detail about who Harry Fipps, the Satin Man, is in a minute. But Bill, you became involved in this case. I mean, it was more than 2 decades after, the children disappeared. So you have continued to investigate it ever since, and you've often had to work independently of police. And this is something that I've seen throughout your book, is that the role of detectives and police in this case has been very difficult because they have been inundated with theories and people suggesting things, and they have even at times, without permission from, people up their chain, gone and investigated things off the back of, clairvoyance and all kinds of crazy stuff with this case. Just how difficult is it to bring new theories to those who are officially investigating the Beaumont children now?
Well, we've had a great deal of difficulty with it throughout the investigation. I became involved in 2008, which was 4 decades after the event. And it was a very cold case, obviously, after all those years. But it was a very interesting case that was put to me by Stuart. When he first contacted me, I wouldn't say I was reluctant, but I was a bit cautious about getting involved in something like this. We had many meetings with police over the years. We'd given them volumes and volumes of information, which all strangely disappeared. And we had to keep reproducing volumes of information every time someone new took over the cold case. So it's been a hard road. It's been difficult, yes, indeed.
Well, Stuart, can you take us back to the beginning of this for people? I mean, I think people are all in different stages of their awareness of what happened to the Beaumont children. They would have seen headlines over the years that, maybe give them some idea of what happened. But can you take us back to 1960s Somerton Park and Glenelg? Because many people who initially hear this story are often appalled that a mother would allow 3 small children, the 10 and under, to go to the beach by themselves. But can you give us an idea of exactly what that area was like, why parents were allowing their children to go to the beach by themselves, even like Grant was 4 years old. Like, it seems completely out of our realm of understanding now of what 1960s Adelaide looked like.
There was an old saying, be home before the street lights came on. So in the school holidays, children roamed the areas around your suburbs and beyond. And you've got to remember that we had creeks that weren't cemented in. We had rolling hills. I was up at a place called Seacombe Gardens at the base of the Adelaide Hills, and you could walk for miles up there. And there was creeks and there was orange trees, and you went adventuring. All you had to do was to be home before the street lights came on. That's what kids did at that time. My mother, usually my mum, because my dad was in the Air Force, he was away, she didn't know where we were. We had no cell phones. We had nothing. It was just like, yes, we're going to a friend's place and we're going off exploring. So there was many things to do. In the summer, the Adelaide heat, as you know, would get up to 30 degrees Celsius or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and you'd head down the beach, which I did at Seacombe Gardens, down to Brighton Beach, which is our favourite because it had the jetty, but also Collie Reserve, where there was – this is what Mostyn said and people don't understand, is that Collie Reserve was packed, was absolutely packed. When I went down there with my friends, we would walk 6 kilometres by ourselves. The first time I went to Collie Reserve, I was 5 years old. 5 years old. I went with the next door neighbour, Rosalind, always remembered that. She was 11. We walked. This is after the movies. We saw A Hard Day's Night. But that's what we did. There was no, what's going to happen to us? We just had to get home before the street lights came on. So it was an adventure playground for kids. It's very rare for a child to be abducted. It's fed into us these days to keep your kids close to you. And I do that because we've been involved with the Beaumont children. But back then we didn't have that media. It was free and easy. It was an unbelievable kids' lifestyle. And Jane, Arnna and Grant, even though Grant was 4, it didn't matter. And they only had to walk down to Collie Reserve. It was 2 kilometres? That's nothing. We were walking 6, 10. Sometimes we were out all day, as long as we were back home before the streetlights came on.
Well, let's talk about that day. It's January 26, 1966. It's 40-something degrees that day, which is not uncommon for that time of year. So the beach would have been packed that day. And Mum, who is, busy, she's got housework to be done. Nancy's like, what do I do with these 3 kids? They're pestering me. They've all been, ragging on each other. And, the 2 little ones are saying that, Jane has a boyfriend, and they're all kind of, mucking around and annoying Nancy. So she's like, right, I can't have them walk to the beach 2Ks today. It's 40 degrees. I'll give them a few coins. They can catch the bus, get some lunch, and come back again around midday. So they had it all planned out. The bus dropped them off basically not far from the beach on Jetty Road, which, true to its name, runs down to the jetty, which is at the beach. And so they go off adventuring. What do we know exactly happened after they got off the bus to the last time that they were seen, which was at the bakery?
They got off the bus, made their way down to the Collie Reserve. On the way there, saw the postman, the local postman who they knew, waved to him, said hello, went down to the reserve. Now we're getting to eyewitness accounts. The children came on the reserve, put the towels down on the grassy area, and went into the beach area where the water was, had a bit of a play around there, came out and put the towels down close to a man who'd been already on the reserve lying on a towel. They got very close to that man, and in fact, the 2 youngest ones went over and started playing with him, which indicated to me and to Stuart a certain form of familiarity there for them to do that, because we're told by Mrs. Beaumont that the children were not like that. They wouldn't just go to some stranger and engage with them. Jane was far too smart for that, and she was. She was a smart kid. So they were playing on the reserve with this man. They were flicking him with the towel. and all that sort of shayaking was going on. At one stage, he went down into the water, and he came back out, and this is where it gets really strange again. The man, or Jane, allowed the man to dry the children and to dress them after they'd come out of the water. Totally out of character for Jane to allow that. Mrs. Beaumont could not believe that when she was told that. But it happened because the eyewitnesses saw it happening. The children had continued to play with the man, and at one stage, the man had stood up and said to the people nearby, bearing in mind there was thousands around, the place was packed, said to those around, "Has anybody seen anybody near our clothes? Somebody's nicked our money." They then packed up just after midday and left the reserve, walking towards the men's changing rooms. And that was the last of people that the reserve saw of the children. And for many years, the next sighting was at Wenzel's Bakery. But that changed. That changed in 2007 because we got another witness. So what we know now is that the children left the reserve, gone down towards the men's changing rooms, and then no one has seen this, but presumably have walked up to Harry's house, which is a distance of about 190 metres.
190 metres, yeah.
Yeah, 190 metres from the reserve. The story is then taken up now at the home, and that was taken up by Harry's son, Hayden Fipps, who told us that he'd been at his little daytime school holiday job, and he'd come home at lunchtime, and he'd gone into what he called a cubby. Now, the cubby wasn't a cubby like most people imagine, something up in a tree house or something. What he called a cubby was a few planks leaning against the fence, and he'd gone in there for a sly smoke. While he was there, he saw 3 children coming in to the backyard, just walking, go straight to Harry. Harry at that time was loading his car up with surfboard bags. Now, when I spoke to Hayden and asked him what was in the surfboard bags, he said Harry's dresses. Harry was a fetishist and a cross-dresser. He had a fetish for satin, hence the book, Satin Man. And we know that when he handled satin, saw satin, thought about satin, he became so sexually aroused that he was known to spontaneously ejaculate. It was so arousing for him. So here we have 3 little children, which they'd spoken to Harry, who'd been handling satin dresses, so he would have been in a state of excitement, and he took them inside the house. They were inside the house for a period of time, and then Harry came back out and continued to load the car with his bags and drove away. Hayden says that was the last time he saw the children and Harry in that situation. We now take it up at Wenzel's Bakery, which is about 120 metres walk from Harry's house, where the children arrived there, and Jane had suddenly found a £1 note because she paid for 6 meals. It was 5 pasties, 1 pie, 6 finger buns, and 2 bottles of pop with a £1 note. When they arrived and you remember at the reserve, allegedly their money had been stolen. Our money's been nicked. So she had no money. 2 things that means. 1, where did she get the £1 note? But 2, she was in the hands of the person who took the money, because he's the person they could rely on to get them home and give them more money to buy lunch for the mum and themselves and someone else. The children were never seen again after buying the food from the bakery. They just disappeared into thin air. And that's part of the mystery.
What Hayden said, he said he saw the children at his house around lunchtime. Those children and the man left that reserve, as Bill said, with no money. And it was around 12:05. They end up at Wenzel's Bakery around 12:25. Now, they leave the reserve with no money, none. They've got 20 minutes to collect that money and then end up at Wenzel's Bakery, it marries in exactly what Hayden had said. They came into the backyard. We've walked up, myself and Bill, we've done this at a slow pace. You've got to think they've got Grant Beaumont in hand and it's 100 degrees heat. We've walked up to those change rooms at a slow pace, waited there, and then walked straight down Augusta Street, that from the Rundavel, or from where they were playing, you only have to look down. You can see Harry's place. It's 190 metres. You walk down there. We did this at a slow pace, waited, collected the pound note or made out, and then walked to Wenzel's. It was 19 minutes. It fits like a glove.
How much of a reliable source is Hayden? Because, I mean, a lot of this new evidence is based on his story. And how did we find out his story in the end? Because it obviously wasn't brought up back when the immediate investigation was happening. And in fact, the pound note was kept quiet from people for a very long time too. It was a fairly integral part of this investigation. Police thought that it would become something bigger down the track if they ever found someone to match it to. But how reliable is Hayden? How did his evidence actually come to light?
I found Hayden. I've met him. Bill's met him. Look, I've done reference checks on him. I'm in the recruitment game, so that's what I do. He's credible. He can be, excuse the expression, he can bullshit a bit, yes. When the book came out, quite a few people came forward, which true crime do, and they called with their theories. But there was one particular person that came forward, was a lady called Angela Fife, but she was married to Hayden, so it was Angela Fipps. She'd bought that book, and it enlightened her because she didn't realise that the man seen with the kids at the beach that day was known to give out pound notes. One, that she believed her husband, Hayden Fipps, at that time had been sexually abused by his father, Harry, he talked about. And Hayden showed all the characteristics of being sexually abused because with Angela, she was a psych nurse at one of the establishments up in North Queensland, and she was dealing with and working with victims of child sexual abuse. That Hayden a lot of times would be caught with his face down in the pillow making grunting noises in the middle of the night, and he'd be sweating. He was also very erratic. He suffered from alcoholism. He suffered from depression, anxiety, and it got to a point that they split up. Angela couldn't take it anymore. But when she read the book, she put one and one together. The pound note, she didn't know. She's thinking where Harry lives. She believed that Harry was a pedophile, so you've got a pedophile living 190 metres from Collie Reserve, hands out pound notes, fits the description to an absolute T. That was the three major things that she put forward. That spiked Alan Whittaker's interest. He called me and he said, "Are you sitting down?" And once he told me that, I had a chill go up my backbone, which has happened a few times, and I knew we were onto something. I've even got it right now. I believe I was onto something.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Claire Murphy. I'm speaking with writer Stuart Mullins and former South Australian Police Detective Bill Hayes about the Beaumont children's disappearance. Up next, Stuart and Bill talk more about the man they think is guilty for the disappearance of the Beaumont children, Harry Fipps. Can we talk a little bit about Harry Fipps? What kind of man he was seen as? Because I understand he had quite the two different personas, one that was very public and one that was very private, and how he would be in a position to be able to randomly hand out pound notes because, as you mentioned, that's like handing out a 50 these days. So he was a very well-off man and I understand very well connected. Can you give us an idea of who Harry Fipps was in the 1960s and 70s?
Harry was a gentleman who was very successful in business. He was an engineer by training, as was his father. He had built up a small business, engineering type business, to what Castalloy became, which was a major foundry manufacturer.
And for those people who aren't from Adelaide, the cast alloy factory employs like loads of people. It's a pretty big operation, right? Like it's no small meat and potatoes factory here.
It sits on a 7-hectare site. So that gives you any idea. It's about 6 football fields or more. It's huge. It was huge. Anyway, he built that up into the business it became. He was a multimillionaire, hence his ability and capacity to give out £1 notes. As a person, he was a Jekyll and Hyde, a definite Jekyll and Hyde. He's, to some people, he's the hell person, well met type individual. He was well dressed, debonair, suave, smart. The other side of him was a side that few people saw, and that was the pedophile side, or the psychotic side of the person who would fly off the handle in an incredible rage from 0 to 100 in a split second for no apparent reason. It just happened. These psychotic rages he had are evidenced throughout his life. So those unfortunate enough to see that side of him and surviving have never forgotten what they saw and what he did. So he was out in the community doing the good things that rich people do. Then behind that veil was the other Harry. And he, unfortunately, is the Harry that we believe the Beaumont children met.
And this is the man we refer to as the Satin Man, right?
Correct. Mm-hmm. Correct. So that man was evil. He was cruel. He was a psycho. He really was a nutcase. Once he got aroused, there was no stopping him. Absolutely no stopping him. Hayden gave an example of Harry's arousals when he explained his own rapes to me when Harry had raped him, and how as a 4 or 5-year-old child, Hayden would lie in his bed at night, waiting to hear the swish of satin coming down the hallway, because he knew Harry was coming down wearing one of his satin dresses and Hayden was about to get raped. That was his life and his experience of his father. He hated his father throughout his life, and we always said there was a reason for that. We couldn't find out the reason. We thought it was because he'd been abusing him, and certainly that was a big part of it. But we now believe there was other reasons too why he hated his father. But Harry, for the people who met him, the Mr. Hyde character, for those people who were unfortunate to meet Mr. Hyde in Harry's character, it was an unforgettable and horrible experience. For those others who saw the other side of him, they would never believe that Mr. Hyde had ever lived. Harry was a great guy, looked after the guys at work, paid them well, threw great parties. Yeah, he did. But that's all part of his front. So that's Harry in a nutshell, 2 people.
Can we talk about those people who would find out later on that they were the victims of this Satin Man? Because you've written books, including The Satin Man, where people have identified who this person is and gone, hang on, I think I'm also the victim of this person. Can you talk us through who some of those people are and what their experiences have been?
The first really notable one, we've had several, but one really notable one was a lady, I interviewed her at length. Her story was compelling. So there was a man that would stand outside of Castleroy every day and watch her and her friend walk to school together and wave at them and smile. Nice Harry. And it was Harry. That went on for some considerable time. And on this particular day, she'd gone up to Streeter Street, up past Streeter Street to Kincaid Avenue, which is the street behind Castleroy, to go to her friend's house to do some homework together. She stayed longer than she planned, and she had to leave to get home. So she's making her way home down Streeter Street towards Kincaid Avenue, and the man that she'd been watching was standing in Streeter Street. There he was, same guy. And as she walked down the street, she crossed the road to the other side of the street from where he was, and he came across the street towards her, met her towards the middle of the road, put his arm gently on her shoulder, and started speaking to her in a very nice, pleasant way. She recalled that because he wasn't rough and gruff like her father, and he smelt really well. And he gently spoke to her as he was guiding her across to the other side of Street to Street, down towards the junction of Street to Street and Moringi Avenue. That's now a car park. Back then, when this happened, it was a bit of waste ground that had piles of earth piled up, and kids would use it for the bikes, up and down on the bikes over these piles of earth. He guided her into that corner of all those piles of earth, which was sheltered from the street by its bulk. He sat her down, spoke to her, and to cut a long story short, he eventually raped her. When he finished raping her, he stood up, and as is typical behaviour we know of Harry Fipps, he started wiping the dust off his clothing and blaming her for getting his clothes dirty. Look what you've done. Look at the nice clothes. You've been all dirty. It's all your fault. So he'd done this change, started to go to bad, Harry. She ran home. She got home. She was dishevelled, dirty. Her mother said nothing, let her in, told her she better go and get changed before her father came home. Her father came home, and that was it for a while. She didn't say anything to her mother and wouldn't say anything to her father because he would have blamed her. If she'd have brought the police to his house, she would have got the biggest beating she'd ever had. He was a violent man, and she didn't tell him. However, it did cause behavioural changes in her, so much so that she left home when she was about 17 or 18 and was being looked after by a couple, who were a nice couple, who were very kind to her, and they tried to work out what had happened to her. So she told them this story that I've just told you. And they convinced her to call the police. They called in the South Australia Police, and the uniformed police officer responded and came to see her and spoke to her about what had happened. He then basically told her how difficult it would be for the police and for her to prove this. There's no evidence, no forensic evidence. It's an old case. Nobody's going to believe you, all that sort of stuff. So much so that she decided it wasn't worth it. So she just let it go. She had continued to be a bit of a troublesome child or a young person, and eventually ended up interstate, where she began to settle down. She had married a police officer who became a senior police officer over there and was quite happy. She had told some friends about her childhood and what had happened to her. And one day, she's watching something on TV. It happened to be a program Stuart and I had done. And they flashed Harry's photograph up there. And she said to a friend who was sitting with her, "That's the one who raped me. That's the guy who raped me." And that truly is the first time she knew his name was Harry Fipps.
Next, how close are we to finding the remains of the Beaumont children? Stuart, you have been researching Harry Phipps's connection to the missing Beaumont children for quite some time. And during this time, while Nancy has passed away, Jim has still been alive through this process. He's sadly passed on now. But have you taken your belief of Harry Fipps' connection to his missing children to him personally?
Mostyn Matters had kept in contact with him over the years. And when he got involved with me and Bill regarding Harry Fipps, he went to see him, had a cup of tea with him, because he was the first detective on the case. He was the first detective to meet the distraught Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont. So Jim trusted him, knew where he lived. Most people knew where he lived, and went around to see him. I got a call from Mostyn to say that he had caught up with Jim and that he was very appreciative of what both myself and Bill were doing. But that's all he said regarding that. he does say publicly that, he doesn't want to be, his hopes raised and yet dashed again. But on this occasion, he didn't say that in Austin. He actually was grateful. And that gave me and Bill, I felt pleased with that. I could see that he could see what we were doing was the right thing to do. Now, what he thought of Harry Fipps, I don't know, but he was appreciative of this. So that was a quiet consolation that we were doing the right thing. We knew we were. And I would say, going even further, that, dealing with and Bill has too, with the major crime, we've got this in the book. Do they have the time? Do they have the resources to what myself and Bill have done over all these years? Which investigation takes precedent over another one? Is it an investigation or a true crime mystery of, 50, 60 years old? Or they've got more pressing matters. And those pressing matters are also exemplified by the media. The media is going to put pressure on them to get things solved. The public are going to do that. So I believe what we've heard, they're quite appreciative even of what me and Bill are doing, because we're heading in the right direction. We've got the time. I mean, it does interfere with our own work, but we've got the time. We do have the resources. We're not silly. And we're heading in the right direction. So I think the police most probably breathe a sigh of relief, even though they don't say it.
Speaking of police, what has to eventuate for them to finally go to the Castello site in, I think the first dig was around 2013, for them to start actually looking for the remains of the Beaumont children at Harry Phipps's factory site? What has to happen to get them there?
There's two boys, David and Robin Harkin. They read the Satin Man book, Searching for the Beaumonts, and then the Satin Man. They called Alan Whittaker initially and said they had dug a grave-size hole. Once they found out it was Harry Fipps and Castello, they called Alan Whittaker, and again, Alan Whittaker called me and said, again, are you sitting down? There was two brothers that dug this grave-size hole at the back of the factory back in 1966. And it was only 3 days after the children go missing, and Harry Fipps was there watching them. And also, when they finished that hole, they were pounding pound notes. There we see, it's follow the money. Who hands out? You've got a pound note there, you've got a pound note with Jane, and then you've got a pound note a few days later. So that obviously pricked my ears up, and of course Bill got involved, and of course, he followed it through. So it was like, oh, here we go.
Yeah, I took statements from both the brothers, both now obviously mature men, both business professionals, and they could quite clearly recall digging the hole back in 66 because of the nature of the hole. There was nothing nearby to put in the hole. They couldn't work out why they were digging this bloody great hole in 40-degree heat. They couldn't work out why. As I said, there was nothing there. That mystified them that this older bloke who was supervising him was going to have to put whatever he wanted to put in the hole himself. Then he would have to fill this big hole, which they had dug out, which was a massive task for them. And how was he going to do it, just on his own? They couldn't work it out. And that remained with them. They'd go to barbecues years later and joke about the time they dug the grave. Wonder what to put in there. There was nothing there to put in.
What happened in that first dig, and what led you to go back and recheck it afterwards?
Hayden saw the dig on TV and rang his cousin, who was his closest lifetime friend, and said, quote, "They're digging in the wrong fucking place." That was upheld by the fact that we found nothing in that area at all. We dug the hole. It wasn't a hole anything like the one that we dug, nor was a 2018 hole that the police dug. It was nothing compared to the hug that we did recently. That was a massive dig. They had dug a hole. I think the thought I got from it, watching it and seeing it and listening to them, was they just dug a hole to shut us up again. once again shut us up. It didn't, but they thought it would. So the dig was unsuccessful in the first instance because I think it was the wrong place. The key was that the guys went in through a gate, the first gate in Castleroy. What we didn't realise at the time was that the first gate in 2013 was not the first gate in 1966. The first gate was further back. Now, that wasn't until we dug the second hole, up further, and we found something with the ground penetrating radar and equipment that we used. We found some anomalies there. A hole was dug. That hole was dug in 2018. Again, we found the hole with nothing in it. So there's a big massive hole, nothing there. And what was interesting too was we found another hole that had been dug like an L shape towards the first hole. So we had the first hole dug by the two boys, which we could see quite clearly on the graph that we had. And then another one intersecting across the bottom of the first hole, of the 2018 hole, like an L shape. And I wondered about why was that? Because when they dug out the 2018 hole, they dug out both holes, and there wasn't even a screw in the second hole, the added hole, didn't have anything in it. So somebody's dug a massive great hole and not put anything in it. Likewise with the other original 1966 hole that we dug in 2018, that too contained nothing. A couple of animal bones about 2 feet down. So we went and dug again at a really, really big dig. I think we dug 10,000 cubic metres in the initial dig, and that's a massive hole. Then things started to happen. Different things started to happen. On the last day of the big dig, we had a member of the public standing beside a press conference that we were holding. We had 15 minutes to get off site. So it was it. Last press conference, see you later, we're out, we're off. So he approached us and gave some information of some research he'd been doing as a member of the public and also as a former employee of Castleroy about the more likely area of where the children might be buried. He nominated, cut a long story short, he nominated the very northeastern corner as being the place where the shit pit that Hayden had referred to was. That's where all the rubbish, gas, trash, whatever, from the factory were dumped in that northeastern corner. Another thing had happened. After the guy had spoken to us about what his research had shown, Stuart got a phone call.
Yeah, there was, let's call the lady Sharon. She called, she'd been watching the dig to say that she'd been abused and that she was told some certain information regarding the same corner. They don't know each other. They corroborated that same corner. And I think that one time we were going to write the chapter called Under the Peppercorn Tree because that's where the peppercorn is. But she spoke to me about being sexually abused inside those Castleroy cottages. She spoke about the corner, the far corner under the peppercorn tree.
There was a couple of cottages on the Castleroy site, and there was one in particular that was known as Harry's cottage that he only had access to, but you had heard that it was where he stored a lot of those silk dresses that's correct. We talked about earlier.
It was under lock and key, and it was Harry's cottage, so no one was allowed in there. So what she had described inside those cottages, myself and Bill have been inside that cottage before they've been demolished, and she was talking about the wood panelling in the second room, and lo and behold, the old 1960s, 70s wood panelling was there. So she had been inside those cottages, and that's where the sexual abuse had occurred. She was very descriptive. What she also, and I've learnt this, that when people are talking about their sexual abuse, when they start to talk about the colours and the feel and the smell, they're actually living it. They're not making it up. So the more she talked, I basically said, this is a job for Bill. being a trained detective. I found her very credible. What she was saying was very credible. And it corroborated what other people were saying that she couldn't possibly know. And she mentioned names, she couldn't possibly have known unless she was there. So after talking to her, I was convinced that she was telling the truth, and I introduced her to Bill Hayes. We knew we were onto something, but this really nailed it.
I found her to be a reluctant witness, if I can say it that way. It was like pulling teeth, really. But you'd get there, you'd get stuff, and she had stuff to say. And she had told me about, there's a note that was left on the gate at Castleroy in 2016, the 50th anniversary of the children being abducted. And that note, and it says that the two girls were buried there at Castleroy, but the little boy wasn't. And may he rest in peace, or may he rest in peace, all that sort of stuff. It was a note that really piqued our interest back in 2016, because we felt that the way this note was done and the trouble they'd gone to make it the way they had, this person knew something. On the bottom of the note was the initials C.S. ... So we couldn't work out who that was. There was one person we thought it was, but we've been proven to be wrong. And I spoke to her about that. She told me that she had created and left a note. She described the letter set she used to create it, and also the typewriter that she used to type it, and the typecast was on there of that typewriter. I asked her what the initials CS meant, because her initials were not CS. She described to me that was a cryptic crossword clue that she just wanted to give. And CS ... stands for C.S. Lewis, who was the author of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which was Jane's favourite book at the time of her abduction. And that was the cryptic clue she gave. We went across and I spent the entire day with her, interviewing her by audio tape and video recording, and then finished up with a lie detection test. She told me about certain things that had happened within her family that were pedophiles. She had a family of pedophiles. She was taken by some pedophile members of her family to visit a friend in South Australia when she was about 10 or 12 years old during the school holidays, and she was taken to Castleroy. And they were met at Castleroy by the owner of the factory, Harry Fipps, who took them to the foundry to see the foundry, showed her his car, the Pontiac Parisienne, and then took her to his cottage, that cottage that only he had. While he was in there, he showed her racks containing satin clothes, dresses, hanging up, and asked her would she like to pick one. It was the one she would like. She picked one, although they're all too big for her, and then he took her into the room, laid her down, and he vaginally raped her. Finished vaginally raping her, got up and left the room for a short time, then returned to the room wearing the satin dress that she picked, and he anally raped her. Now, we know this with more than one person has been Harry's MO, vaginal and anal rape. She then talked to me about the Beaumont children. She told me that one of her rapists as a child was another pedophile who was called John. And John had basically held her captive, if you like, back when she was about 21 years old at his house interstate. And when she wasn't handcuffed to the table, he had a shotgun in her face, she said. He told a story of the Beaumont children and Harry Fipps. This man knew Harry and admitted that he was a member of Harry's pedophile group. She started the story that he was drunk, but he was lucid. He told her that he'd been told by someone that the children had been abducted from the Collie Reserve and taken to the Castle factory on the day of their abduction. That during that first day, for some reason, the little boy, right, something had happened there, and they took him away and placed him in some nearby stables. He then took her back to the cottages where the girls were raped by Harry Fipps, by Hayden Fipps, and by another person called Bill or William Robson. Apparently, that was how the rapes occurred, that Hayden had raped Jane only, Harry and Robson had raped Jane and Arnna. Little Arnna had become extremely upset on one of the days, probably the first day, and had been brutally assaulted physically by Fipps. I have to say I was a hardened investigator. I've seen lots of stuff, and it made me feel sick when I was being told what she told me. The children were kept for 2 days being raped, were kept overnight in cupboards, in the cottages, locked in cupboards, which again would have been absolutely terrifying. Poor little Arnna was afraid in the dark. I can't believe what they went through. Excuse me.
Do you need a moment, Bill?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I understand that. That's how I felt when he first told me. The other thing is that lady mentioned the two names, Bill Robson and a guy called John Little. Bill called me and said, "Have you heard of these people?" I called Hayden's closest cousin and said, "Have you heard of these people?" And he said, "Yeah." He said one was a close family friend. He used to visit Harry all the time because the closest cousin lived only around the corner. So there was number one. She couldn't possibly have known these people without being told that she was there. And the other one was Bill Robson. I said, "Who's this guy?" And he worked at Castello. He was basically Harry Phipps's right-hand man. So there's two names. And she didn't just pluck them out of the air. She had to have been there. And so I called Bill, and there was another thing that we knew she was truthful, but to come out with just mentioning a person's name, unless you've been there, you don't guess those sorts of things. So I passed it on to Bill, and it was another aspect of her truthfulness of what happened.
The man who was speaking to her gave a description of the hole they were digging at the peppercorn tree in the northeastern corner, and he said that they were buried under concrete. And then he corrected it and said it was like a concrete dust. But they didn't make it hard. They didn't put water over it because of the hue and cry that was going on at the time because of the abduction. And they just covered it up and thought it'll harden naturally or whatever. So that was thrown over the bodies because he used to tell her when she was a child, if you don't do as you're told, you'll be buried under concrete like the Beaumonts. We got back in, and we were really grateful to get back in because we hadn't reached that point when we threw the track. You can imagine my heart sinking because I knew what I was looking for. No one else did. I didn't tell them about the grey concrete. And I was looking to see if I could see that. And before we got to that part where I believed it would be, we threw the track and we were told we couldn't come back. I was beside myself basically because I had to see that area to see was there something there now, given she's saying that the kids were there, buried there, and were under this concrete powder. So we dug on. And when we got to the peppercorn tree, we started to uncover grey powder, about 3 feet down under the surface. And it was exactly as described by the bloke who was telling the story to our victim. Exactly as described. It was still powder because it wasn't concrete. That is very significant. There's no way that he, she, or anyone could have known that that powder was buried in that ground 3 feet deep from the surface to tell us that that's what was thrown over the kids. That was very telling for me. We didn't find anything which was curious in that northeast corner. And that makes me more curious than anything because You remember that was a shit pit.
Mm.
So something's been through there.
Cleared it out.
Cleaned up.
Because what you're looking for with the cast alloy or any alloy factory, you've got to look at their waste material, and it's quite extensive. That comes from chemical containers, which are made of metal, because, back in the 1960s, everything was made from metal. It wasn't plastics, wasn't, you bought your ice cream in an ice cream tin. So you've got metal containers. You've got, obviously, filings, shavings, dross, which is the leftover heavy metal material. That's got to be dumped somewhere. And that's when Hayden, and I mentioned this to Bill this morning for our next Facebook post, is he mentioned the pit, not a pit. There is a defined location, the shit pit. As I said, he had a specific spot, hence what Bill said earlier, they're digging in the fucking wrong spot, is he knows where that is. Where we dug, either they've moved it out or we're not quite in the right spot, because I was waiting, apart from the children's remains, is that I was hoping that we would hit canisters or hit metal, some sort of metal, something that would indicate that there was a dump there was a shit pit. And it hasn't been found. Either, as Bill said, they've picked it up and taken it elsewhere, or it's still there somewhere. But again, it's like needle in a haystack. Where is the shit pit?
With that clarity, though, just to finish, is it enough if we don't find the remains of these children with the clarity that you now have around this story and the fact that that site now is going to be redeveloped, they're going to build houses over the top of it, there might not be recourse to check ever again, and now there's not too many people left alive who are directly involved in all of this. I mean, Hayden has passed now, as has Angela. So is there enough clarity around this? Do we put this to rest with what you found out?
Well, I wouldn't put it to rest. I'd never put it to rest. But we so far have done everything humanly possible that we could possibly do. Am I disappointed? Yes. However, it's now for the general public to come forward. Like this lady, it's a domino effect. You get one person coming forward, two people, and this is what's happening now, is that even with this podcast, with the book coming out, I would be of the belief that other people will now feel empowered, that they're going to be believed, that they come forward with their story. So disappointed with the dig, but I believe there's still more to go, especially after this book and this podcast, is that people will finally, some people, like the lady or the several ladies beforehand, will have the courage to come forward and tell their story. If they feel that going to the police, to Crime Stoppers, I can understand that. Will they be believed? Will somebody get back to them? Just come to us direct. We will listen, because if it's happened to 1, 2 and 3, it's happened to 20, 30. And I'll give you an example. Gerard Risdale, Catholic priest, 54 counts of child sexual abuse. It started with one, and that one person who came forward initially wasn't believed. Now there's another 53. And that's what I believe, and I'm quite sure Bill does, is going to happen here.
Thank you to Stuart and Bill for helping us tell this story. You can find their book, Unmasking the Killer of the Missing Beaumont Children, at the link in our show notes. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Claire Murphy, and produced by Tali Blackman, with audio designed by Jacob Round. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.